When we deploy solutions in Azure, it's in our best interest to make sure that those solutions are healthy. When we talk about data science, that health can be about the various pipelines, machine learning models, and overall solutions that we built. But it can also be about the data itself. Now, Azure includes a built-in set of tools in most resources that'll allow you to monitor and gauge the health of your resources. With Azure monitoring tools, you can collect all kinds of information about your resource. Now, that can be its usage, its performance, its capacity, or whatever other sorts of metrics are applicable to that specific type of resource. Now, once all that information is collected, and it's worth noting that that's collected in near real time, you can then analyze that information. Some of that analysis is done automatically by Azure, but of course, you can look at that collected data and make judgments for yourself. Now, once you have the data collected and you've analyzed it, that's when you can create a plan and react to the information. If you're seeing super high memory usage or very low response times, you can react to that information accordingly. And Azure Monitoring can help you with all of that. So let's dig into this a little bit. Now, one of the most common Azure resources to use for storing data is Azure Storage Accounts. Now, using the monitoring tools built into storage accounts, there's a ton of information that you can get that can help you determine its health. For example, one of the bits of information you can collect is capacity, and that's exactly as it sounds. The purpose of this metric is to simply tell you how much data you've got in your storage account. Now, it's often surprising just how much you have in there. Availability is another piece of information you can collect, and this can be critically important to some systems because naturally you'll want to be able to access your data anytime. So if the system isn't available, that's a problem. And so tracking that metric over time can help you take corrective action. And of course, availability is one thing and performance is another. You might be able to access your data, but if it's slow as heck, then that's a problem too. So you can track metrics about the performance of your storage account. Now, with Azure monitoring tools, including those built into storage accounts, you can use a visualization tool to look at your collected metrics. And there's a few ways you can consume those metrics. First, there's the at scale view. The at scale view shows you the current snapshot view of your system health. And this can include all sorts of information from number of requests to latency to capacity and so on. You can even filter that information down to specific data services like blobs, files, tables, queues, entire storage accounts. Then there's the drill down view. Drill down to specific bits of information. So let me give you an example. With Azure, you can use the Azure Monitor resource, and that's a top-level Azure resource that lets you visualize all the health information across all of the resources that you deployed. Then, with that view, you can drill down to specific resources so that you can see the health information about that specific resource. And even then, you can drill down even lower to where it's applicable. So with Azure Monitor, you can see the health of everything, and then drill down to a specific storage account and see the health about it, and then drill down to a specific data service like Blob storage and see the health about that. Now, on top of all that, these views are customizable. You can change what metrics you want to see, update thresholds for when you consider things to be a problem, and view all of that in charts over time. Now, once you've created a chart that you like, you can even name it and pin it to an Azure dashboard for easy consumption later on. Now, as it relates to storage accounts specifically, you can use Azure Monitor to monitor all kinds of health aspects of your storage account. Of course, as we already said, you can use the top-level Azure Monitor resource to view details about all of your Azure sources, including your storage account. And this can include the important aspects like transaction counts, latency, capacity, and so on. But the thing that Azure Monitor is good for, versus the monitoring tools built right into your storage account, is that it can be used to monitor multiple storage accounts all at once. So you don't have to navigate to each of your storage accounts. You can navigate to the top level Azure Monitor service and look at the health information for all your storage accounts all at once. And just like you can use the monitoring tools built right into your storage accounts, you can use the top level Azure Monitor resource to identify issues in your storage accounts all at once. Seeing all your resources in one consolidated view can be very handy if you want to see that there are issues that are systemic versus localized to a single resource. Now, one of the tools that you can use in Azure Monitor is the Overview Workbook. The Overview Workbook allows you to display various metrics for various storage accounts grouped by subscription. Now, once you've created your workbook, you can then filter the displays in a few different ways. For example, you can choose which subscription to look at. You can create a display that can look at any of the subscriptions that you have access to, and that's good. It means you're creating a tenant level dashboard rather than one that you have to repeat for all of your subscriptions. And once you've chosen a subscription, you can then select which storage accounts to view details for. Now, by default, 5 storage accounts in the subscription are selected, and you can select more if you want to, up to 200 in fact. But of course, the more you have, the busier the display is, and maybe the harder it is to see what you're looking for. Lastly, you can filter on the time range. Now, data is collected over time, so you can select a time range and see the information for that. By default, the display usually shows the last 4 hours, but you can choose much longer time ranges if you want. However, it's worth noting that the metrics aren't kept forever, so usually 90 days is your max. Now, besides the Overview Workbook, there's also a Capacity Workbook. Now, the Capacity Workbook is simpler to use than the Overview Workbook because it focuses on the very specific metric of your storage accounts, the total used storage. And when you open the Capacity Workbook, you see the total amount of storage used by each of the storage accounts. There's even the ability to view that information by heat map, so that you can see which systems have the highest capacity compared to others. And you can drill down into these capacities and gain access to further detailed reports about each of your storage accounts too. Now finally, let's quickly talk about performance metrics. Now when we look over performance metrics with Azure Monitor, we can gauge the health of our storage account to see if there's any issues affecting the service. These might have nothing to do with you. Sometimes there's planned outages in a region that could affect the performance of your system, and Azure will let you know about these well ahead of time. You can also use performance metrics to see low-level information like transactions. This can be really handy if you want to see how many reads, writes, or deletes have been performed against your dataset over time. If you're seeing elevated transactions, that can be the root cause of performance issues. And lastly, performance metrics will naturally include aspects like availability and latency. And that's important too. How available is your dataset? How quickly can people get at it? You might have all your data stored in the same storage, but if people can't get to it efficiently, that's no good. So you can review your performance metrics and make adjustments as needed. In this demo, we're going to go over how to monitor an Azure Blob storage account resource. We'll play around with images in the storage account and then explore the metrics associated with our Blob storage resource to see what they tell us. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is head over to the Azure portal in our browser. Perfect. Now before we go too far, this demo assumes that you've already got an Azure Blob storage account configured. So if you don't, you'll need to provision one for yourself. You'll also need to create a container, but you don't have to worry about putting anything in it yet. So what we're going to do in this demo is we're going to configure a Blob storage account to capture some diagnostic information for the purposes of monitoring. Now in order to do that, the information that's captured has to be captured and stored somewhere, and it has to be somewhere different than your actual storage account. So before we can configure our Blob storage monitoring needs, we need to configure the place where we're going to store those logs. So we first need to create another storage account. So let's do it. At the top of the screen, choose the Create a Resource option. Good. Now let's scroll to the bottom of the screen and click on the Create link under Storage Account. Perfect. Now we're being asked to select a resource group to put our storage account in. Now I've already got a resource group called SBDemo17, so I'm just going to select that. Perfect. Now we need to give our storage account a name. I'm going to call mine SBDemo17 Diag. Good. Now I'm going to set the redundancy to locally redundant storage to keep costs down. And now we're ready to go. So let's click Review and Create. And assuming our settings are acceptable, we can then click the Create button. Good. Now this kicks off the creation process. We'll need this for the next step, so I'm just going to fast forward until this is complete. Good. Now we're finally ready to go. Now, as I said earlier, I've got myself a Blob storage account, so I'm going to head over there and configure some monitoring. So in the top search bar, I'm going to navigate to my storage account by typing the name and selecting it from the list. I called mine SBDemo17 Blob. All right. So in this Blob storage account, I have a single Blob container. And like I was saying, that container is empty right now. What we want to do here is configure some monitoring for this storage account. So let's do that. In the left-hand menu, let's scroll all the way down to the monitoring section. Good. And now let's click on the diagnostic settings option. All right. Now this section allows us to configure monitoring for our storage account. As you can see, we can configure monitoring for any of the types of objects a storage account has. So that's blob, queue, table, and file. In our case, we're interested in blob monitoring. So let's click on the blob item in the list. Perfect. Now, when we're monitoring a blob storage account, we can monitor all sorts of different things in all sorts of different ways. The way you configure that is through what's called the diagnostic setting. And as you can see, no diagnostic settings have been configured for a blob storage account yet. So let's create one. Let's click on the Add Diagnostic Setting link. All right. Now this screen will let us create a diagnostic setting for monitoring our blob storage account. The first thing we need to do is give it a name. Well, I'm not very original, so I'm just going to call my setting SBDemo17. Good. Now, under the Category Details section, we can configure what logs and metrics we want to capture. So let's just check all of the options. Good. Now, in the Destination Details section, we can configure where we want to send the information that we're collecting. So the options are to send to Log Analytics Workspace, which means we can send the captured information to an existing Azure Log Analytics resource. Archive to a storage account, which means we can save the information into an existing Azure storage account. Stream to an event hub, which means we can transmit the logs to an Azure event hub so other Azure resources can simply accept them as they arrive. Or send to partner solution, which allows you to transmit the collected information to some other solution. In our case, we're going to select the archive to a storage account option. Good. Now we can select the storage account that we created earlier. Perfect. Now at the top of the screen, let's click Save. All right. So we now have monitoring enabled for our blob storage. So let's do a few things that we can get some information captured for. Let's start by clicking on the breadcrumb and heading back to the root of our storage account. Good. Now let's click on the Storage Explorer option in the left-hand menu. All right. Now let's open up the Blob Containers section and click on our container. Perfect. Now, as I said earlier, my container is empty. So what we're going to do here is we're going to upload some images, download some images, and then delete some images. The point of doing that is to make our blob container record some activity that we should then be able to see in our monitoring that we just enabled. So let's start with the upload. Let's click on the Upload toolbar button. Good. Now let's click to browse for a file. It can be any file you like, but I'm going to insert a couple of images. Good. And now let's click the Upload button at the bottom of the panel. And perfect. Our images are uploaded. So let's close this panel. Okay, now let's download one of the images. With one of the images selected, click the Download toolbar button. Good. Now let's click on the Click here to begin download link. Okay, and we'll open it just to see it. Good. Now let's close this window. And now we can click OK to close the file download pop-up. All right, and now let's delete one of the images. So with one of the images selected, click the Delete option under the More menu. And now let's confirm that delete by clicking the Delete button at the bottom of the panel. Excellent. We've now uploaded, downloaded, and deleted content in our blob container. So let's see what our monitoring tells us. In the left-hand menu, let's scroll back down to the monitoring section. Good. Now let's choose the Metrics option. All right. Now this screen shows us a chart that we can then use to explore the various bits of information we've collected about our storage account. In the metric namespace pull-down, let's choose Blob. Good. Now in the metric pull-down, let's choose Transactions. Cool. Our chart has some data. Of course, all the activity that we just did was at the end, so let's change the time frame to see this a bit better. In the top right corner, let's click on the local time label. And let's choose the last 30 minutes, and then click Apply. There, that's better. So now we can see that there's lots of various activity performed against our blob storage account in the last 30 minutes. So let's break this down a bit more though. Let's click on the Add Filter button in the toolbar above the chart. Good. Now in the property field, let's choose API name. And in the values field, let's choose put blob. Nice. Our chart updated to show us how many blobs we inserted into our container during that time period. And remember, we added 2 images, so we can see a spike of 2 in there. Perfect. Now let's change the filter a bit. Let's click on the filter object again so we can edit it. And good. Now let's click on the values pull down, and this time let's select the get blob option. And you'll also have to unselect the put blob option. In there, our chart updated again. And remember, we downloaded 1 blob from our container, and that's exactly what this is telling us. Nice. So let's change the filter one more time. Click on it to edit it. And now let's change the values pull down to delete blob. And remember to unselect get blob. All right, once again, our chart updated, and once again, it tells us that we deleted 1 blob during that time. And that's it. I mean, it's that simple. With a Blob storage account, you can enable diagnostic monitoring, store the diagnostic information in another storage account, and then access the metrics using the metrics view in your Blob storage account. Great job! In this demo, we're going to go over how to monitor an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 resource. We'll play around with images in the data lake and then explore the metrics associated with our resource to see what they tell us. All right, so the first thing we need to do is head over to the Azure portal in our browser. All right, now before we go too far, this demo does assume that you've already got an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage account configured. If you don't, you'll need to provision one for yourself. You'll also need to create a container, but you don't have to worry about putting anything in it just yet. So what we're going to do in this demo is we're going to configure a Data Lake Gen 2 storage account to capture some diagnostic information for the purposes of monitoring. Now, just like with the blob storage monitoring we did in the last demo, the information that's being captured has to be captured and stored somewhere. So for the purposes of this demo, we're going to use the same storage account that we created in the last demo to store our diagnostic information. But if you want to have a separate storage account, you can do that for yourself. Anyway, as I said earlier, I've got myself a Data Lake Gen 2 storage account, so I'm going to head over there and configure some monitoring. Now in the top search bar, I'm going to navigate to my data lake by typing the name and selecting it from the list. I called mine SBDemo17DL. All right, so in this data lake, I have a single container, and like I was saying, that container is empty right now. So what we want to do here is configure some monitoring for this data lake. So let's do that. In the left-hand menu, let's scroll down to the monitoring section. Good, and let's click on the diagnostic settings option. All right, now this section allows us to configure monitoring for our data lake. Now, as you know, a Data Lake Gen 2 resource is basically a specially configured storage account. So that means that we're seeing similar account types that we'd see in a storage account. But in our case, we just see Blob. So let's click on that item in the list. Perfect. Now, when we're monitoring a Data Lake Gen 2 storage account, we can monitor all sorts of different things in all sorts of different ways. And the way you configure that is the same as with a storage account, and that's with a diagnostic setting. Now, as you can see, no diagnostic settings have been configured for this data lake yet, so let's create one. Let's click on the Add Diagnostic Setting link. Perfect. Now this screen will let us create a diagnostic setting for monitoring our data lake. The first thing we need to do is give it a name. And since I'm not very creative, I'm going to call my setting SBDemo17. Good. Now under the Category Details section, we can configure what logs and metrics that we want to capture. So let's check all the options. All right. Now in the Destination Details, we can configure where we want to send the information we're collecting. Now our options are the same as with the previous demo. And just like we did with the Blob storage account, we're going to select the Archive to a Storage Account option. Good. Now we can select the storage account we created in our previous demo. Perfect. Now at the top of the screen, let's click Save. All right. So we now have monitoring enabled for our data lake. Now let's do a few things so that we can get some information captured. Let's start by clicking on the breadcrumb and heading back to the root of our storage account. Good. Now let's click on the Containers option in the left-hand menu. Excellent. Now let's open up the only container I have configured in here. All right, so as I said earlier, my container is empty. So what we're going to do here is we're going to upload some images download some images and then delete some images. And the point of doing that is to make our data lake record some activity that we should then be able to see in the monitoring that we just enabled. So let's start with the upload. Let's click the Upload toolbar button. Good. Now let's click to browse for a file, and it can be any file or number of files that you like, but I'm going to insert a couple of images. Good. And now let's click Upload at the bottom of the panel. And perfect. Our images are uploaded. So let's close this panel. All right. So now let's download one of the images. Now with one of the images selected, click the three dots at the end of the line and choose the download option. Okay, and we'll open it up just to see it. Good, there it is. Now let's close this window. All right, now let's delete one of the images. With one of the images selected, click the Delete toolbar button. You can actually also use the Delete option in the three-dot menu for the image if you want to. Now let's confirm the delete by clicking Yes in the pop-up. Excellent. We've now uploaded, downloaded, and deleted content in our data lake. So let's see what our monitoring tells us. First, let's click the breadcrumb and head back to the root of our data lake. Good. Now in the left-hand menu, let's scroll back down to the monitoring section. And now let's choose the metrics option. All right. Now this screen shows us a chart that we can use to explore the various bits of information we've collected about our storage account. So in the metric namespace pull-down, let's choose Blob. Good. Now in the metric pull-down, let's choose transactions. Cool. Our chart has some data. Of course, it's all at the end, so let's change the time frame to see this a bit better. In the top right corner, click on the local time label. And now let's choose the last 30 minutes and click Apply. That's better. Now we can see that there was lots of various activity performed against our data lake. So let's break this down a bit more. Click on the Add Filter button in the toolbar above the chart. Good. Now in the Property field, let's choose API name. And in the Values field, let's choose Put Blob. Nice! Our chart updated to show us how many blobs we inserted into our container during this time period. And remember, we added 2 images, so we can see a spike of 2 in there. That's perfect. So let's change the filter a bit more. Let's click on the filter object so that we can edit it. And now let's click on the Values pull down again, and this time let's select the Get Blob option. But remember, you have to unselect the Put Blob option. There we have our chart updating again. And remember, we downloaded 1 blob item from our container, and that's exactly what this is telling us. Nice. So let's change the filter one last time. Let's click on it to edit it. And now let's change the Values pull down to Delete Blob. And remember to unselect Get Blob. All right. Once again, our chart updated, but this time it told us that we deleted 2 files during this time. That's not exactly right, but these aren't always super accurate. Anyways, that's it. I mean, it's that simple. With a data lake storage account, you can enable diagnostic monitoring, store the diagnostic information in another storage account, and then access the metrics using the metrics view in your data lake account. Great job! In this demo, we'll go over how you can monitor certain types of jobs associated to your Azure Synapse Analytics instance. Now, Azure Synapse Analytics can be used to do lots of things, so we'll keep this demo simple and show you how and where you can access that information. We'll even set up a simple pipeline to show you how to monitor individual runs manually. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is head over to the Azure portal in our browser. Perfect. Now, before we go any further, this demo assumes that you've already got an instance of Azure Synapse Analytics provisioned. Preferably, you already have it set up with links to your various resources with data flowing through, but that's not needed for this demo. If you don't have Synapse actually provisioned, you'll need to do that first. Alright, now I have a Synapse Analytics configured. It's very basic, it doesn't actually have any connections to anything, but for the purposes of this demo, that should be fine. So let's start by heading over to my resource. Now in the top search bar, I'm going to search for my Synapse instance and select it. I called mine SBDemo17 Synapse. Good. Now, as I said, nothing's really been configured for my Synapse instance yet, so there's not much going on. So what we're going to do is go over a couple of different ways that you can monitor activity with Synapse. The first is monitoring pipelines. In the center of our screen, let's click on the Open Synapse Studio link. Perfect. So now we have the Synapse Studio open in a new tab in our browser. So let's start by performing a very simple task. Let's create a pipeline that moves data from one location in a Blob storage account to another. Let's click on the Integrate option in the left-hand menu. It's the one that looks like a sideways cylinder. Good. Now let's create a pipeline. We can do that by clicking the plus button on top of the resource list and choosing Pipeline from the menu. Perfect. Now let's expand the Move and Transform section and add the Copy Data item to the canvas by dragging it into the central part of the screen. All right. Now what this widget does is it copies data from one location to another. Now at the bottom of the screen, we can see the configuration for the widget. So let's tell it where we want to copy data from. Let's click on the Source tab. Good. Now it's asking us to choose a source dataset. Well, we haven't set one up yet, so let's click on the New button. All right. Now in the panel on the right, let's choose Azure Blob Storage as our data source type and then click Continue at the bottom of the screen. Now as for the data type, let's choose Binary and then click Continue again. Perfect. Now we're going to leave the name as is. And in the Linked Service pull-down, let's choose the New option, since we don't have one yet. Good. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to link this to the Blob storage account we used earlier in the course. So in the Azure subscription field, let's choose the subscription that the account is in, and then choose the account itself in the storage account name field. And now we can click Create. Perfect. And now in the container part of the file path field, type the name of your Blob container. Mine was sbdemo17. And finally, we can click OK. Good. So now this widget knows where to get data from. Now let's configure it to tell it where to send data. So click on the Sync tab. Now once again, we're presented with a dataset pull-down, but we don't have an export dataset yet, so let's create one by clicking New. All right. Now let's choose the Azure Blob Storage again and click Continue. And once again, we'll choose Binary as the format type and click Continue again. Good. Now that we've created a linked service last time, we just need to select our linked service this time. Perfect. Now in the File Path field, let's set the container like we did last time, and then set the directory to something like Output. Great. And now we can click OK. So now we have a configured pipeline. At the top of the screen, let's click the Publish All button. This basically saves our work. So let's accept this panel and publish our stuff. Good. Now we're going to run this pipeline. So let's click on the Add Trigger Toolbar button. Perfect. Now we'll just run this manually, so let's click Trigger Now. Okay, and now we can hit OK to get it started. All right. So now the pipeline is running and it's going to copy the data at the root of our Blob storage account into a subfolder that we called Output. So let's wait for this to complete. It might take a while, so I'm going to fast forward to when it's all done. Good. Now our pipeline has run successfully. So let's click on the Monitor option in the left-hand menu. Perfect. Now at the top of this list of options is Pipeline Runs. This should already be selected, but if not, click it now. This screen shows us all the times that we've run our pipeline. So in a world where you've configured Azure Synapse, one way that you can monitor your activity is through this screen. So let's click on our pipeline. Perfect. So here you can see all the activities that were run, and we just had the one run. Whether they succeeded or not, how long they took, and so on. Now over time, this area of Synapse will be filled with all of your runs, and you can gauge the health of your system over time. But this isn't the only place that you can monitor your Synapse instance. So let's go back to the Azure portal. Perfect. Now let's scroll down to the monitoring section. And now let's click on the metrics item. Perfect. Now if we assume that your Synapse instance has been connected to other systems like SQL or Apache Spark pools, then Synapse will constantly collect metrics about that integration. Then, just like we did in the last couple of demos, you can select whichever metric and time frame you'd like to see and get a good idea of how your system is behaving. That can include things like monitoring job success or even looking at adaptive cache metrics. So as you can see, Azure Synapse Analytics can be used to monitor data flow and integration between systems using a variety of techniques. You can monitor specific custom pipelines, or you can even use the built-in metrics charting tool to look at the overall health of your various integrations. So great job! In this demo, we're going to go over how to monitor an Azure Cosmos DB resource. We'll play around with images in Cosmos and then explore the metrics associated with our resource to see what they tell us. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is head over to the Azure portal in our browser. Perfect. Now, before we go too far, this demo assumes that you've already got an Azure Cosmos DB instance configured and that you're using the SQL API. If you don't have one configured like that, you'll need to provision one for yourself. You'll also need to create a database and a container, but you don't have to worry about putting anything in the container just yet. Anyway, I've already got myself a Cosmos DB, so I'm going to head over there and explore what sorts of information I can get from the built-in monitoring. So in the top search bar, I'm going to navigate to my Cosmos DB by typing its name and selecting it from the list. I called mine SBDemo17 Cosmos. Alright. So in this Cosmos DB instance, I have a single database and a single container. And like I was saying, that container is empty right now. Now with Cosmos DB, monitoring is enabled by default. You can technically implement even more detailed logging, but you'll see that the built-in monitoring is pretty good already. So what we want to do first is perform some actions in our Cosmos DB container so that we can see what gets recorded. So let's get started. Let's click on the Data Explorer option in the left-hand menu. Good. And now let's expand the SBDemo17 database and expand the SBDemo17 container. And now let's click on the Items option. Alright, so as I said earlier, my container is empty. So what we're going to do here is we're going to insert some really dummy items, edit an item, and then delete an item. The point of doing this is to make our Cosmos DB record some activity that we should then be able to see in the built-in monitoring we have. So let's start with the insert. Let's click on the New Item toolbar button. Good. Now let's give our item an ID. I'm just going to set mine to 001. And now let's give it a couple of properties. There's actually a needed partition key property called PK, as you can see from the item list on the left. So let's create a property called PK. And I'll just set the value to PK as well. Good. Now let's create a simple property called something like foo. And I'll set the value to bar. Good. And now we can click Save in the toolbar. Perfect. We have our first item in our database. So let's create another one by clicking on the New Item again. This time I'll give my new item an ID of 002. And I'll put in the same partition key. And now I'll create that same foo property, but this time I'll set the value to Baz. Good. Now let's save this item. Perfect. We now have two items. Alright, so let's edit one of the items. Let's choose any of the two items from the list on the left, and I've already got one selected. And now let's change the foo property to something else. I'll change mine to Kaz. Good. Now let's click the Update toolbar button at the top of the screen. Good. Now let's pretend I don't want this little item anymore, so let's click on the Delete toolbar button. And now let's confirm the deletion by clicking OK in the pop-up. Good. Our item is removed. Excellent. So now we've inserted, updated, and deleted content in our Cosmos DB. So let's see what our monitoring tells us. In the left-hand menu, scroll down to the Monitoring section. And now let's choose the Metrics option. Alright. Now this screen shows us a chart that we can use to explore the various bits of information we've collected about our storage account. So in the Metric pull-down, let's choose Total Requests down at the bottom. Cool. Our chart has some data. Of course, it's all at the end, so let's change the time frame to see this a bit better. Now in the top right corner, click on the Local Time label. And now let's choose the last 30 minutes and click Apply. There, that's better. So now we can see that there was lots of various activity performed against our Cosmos DB. So let's break this down a bit more. Click on the Add Filter button on the toolbar above the chart. Now in the property field, let's choose operation type. And in the values field, let's choose create. Nice. Our chart updated to show us how many items we inserted into our container during this time period. So while the chart is at 1, we can see a flat line that seems to imply that there was possibly 2 inserts during that time. So let's change the filter a bit more. Let's click on the filter object so we can edit it. And now let's click the values pull down again, and this time let's select the read option. You'll have to also unselect the create option. And there we have our chart updating again. Now, this one's a bit tricky. Using the Data Explorer, we are reading our items all the time. So this isn't quite the same as downloading a blob like we did in our other demos. So we can see the clear read operations, but admittedly the counts don't match something as atomic as downloading a blob. But these are the read operation counts. Now let's change the filter one more time. Let's click on it to edit it. And now let's change the values pull down to delete, and remember to unselect read. All right, so once again our chart updated, and once again it told us that we deleted one item during that time. Good, now let's do something else. Let's click on the Insights option in the left-hand menu. Good, now in the time range pull down at the top of the screen, let's choose the last 30 minutes once again. Now what this screen is showing us is all kinds of juicy metrics about our Cosmos DB. In the top left corner in the Overview tab, we're seeing the same total request chart that we just created on our own. If we scroll down, we can see a chart that shows us the 429 errors that have happened in this time. Now this is a very handy chart because it tells us that our RU configuration for our containers is underconfigured and we're running into throttling problems. Now all the way at the bottom, we can see some high-level metrics about our containers. Meanwhile, if we scroll all the way back up, there are tabs that break down the metrics for our Cosmos DB even further. For example, if we click on the Request tab, we can see some charts that show us a breakdown of requests by status code result and another 429 chart. So if we scroll down to the bottom, we see the same transaction chart that we just played with in the metrics page broken down by the various operations types. Anyways, that's it. With a Cosmos DB, monitoring is built right in, and you can explore the various metrics and information gathered against your database using all sorts of fancy charts, which you can then pivot to tell you just about anything you want to know. And if you need even more detail still, you can simply explore the logs directly. Great job! In this demo, we're going to create an alert based on metrics that we've collected so far in this course. To do that, we're going to piggyback off of one of our Azure resources to show where we can find and create alerts. We'll then create an alert and watch as the system updates. All right, so as before, the first thing we need to do is head over to the Azure portal in our browser. Perfect. Now, in the last few demos, we went over how to monitor various types of Azure resources. We also took a look at some of the metrics that are built in or that we can generate. In this demo, we're going to use some of those metrics to generate an alert and then view the output of that alert. So let's get started. Let's head over to our Blob storage account. I'm going to search for mine in the top search bar and then click on it to navigate to it. Mine was called SBDemo17 Blob. Perfect. So here's our Blob storage account, minding its own business, serving up data to whomever wants it. Or is it? How can we know that? Well, in one of the early demos in this course, we were able to show how we can look at some collected metrics about this storage account to see blobs being read, updated, or even deleted. So we can certainly sit in front of our computer and just watch the metrics screen to make sure that everything's good, but that's not a very good use of our time. Instead, we want Azure to tell us if something's wrong. So let's set that up. Let's scroll down to the monitoring section and click on alerts. Perfect. Now this screen will show us how many alerts that we've had in the time range we've selected, in our case, the last 24 hours. This screen will show us the severity of the alerts that have happened in the time range so that we can take action. Although sometimes actions have already been taken and so closed alerts will be shown here too. But you'll see all that here in a second. Of course, in our case, we don't have any alerts set up yet anyways, so let's create one. In the toolbar, let's click on the New Alert Rule button. Excellent. Now this screen allows us to build an alert for our storage account. In the Scope section at the top, our storage account has already been selected for us. It's worth noting that you can build and view alerts globally through the Azure Monitoring app, but this will make things a bit easier for us to see. Anyway, now we know which resource we're monitoring, but what are we monitoring it for? Well, for that, we need to create a condition. So in the Condition section, let's click on the Add Condition link. Perfect. So here we get to see all the different metrics and things that we can monitor for in our storage account. In our earlier demo, we showed a metric chart that showed the total number of transactions against our storage account. We were also able to filter the results to certain types of requests. So let's invent something here. Let's create an alert that will tell us if anything has been deleted from our storage account. So let's select the transaction signal from the list. Good. Now we're seeing all the transactions that were performed against our storage account over the last 6 hours. So let's scroll down to the Split by Dimension section. Now let's choose API name as the dimension name. Good. And now let's set the dimension values to delete blob. Good. Now let's scroll back up to the chart. Perfect. Now we see that the chart has updated to just show the number of transactions related to delete operations. Now let's scroll back down to the Alert Logic section. All right, now let's change the operator value to greater than or equal to. And now let's set the threshold value to 0. Good. Now what we've done here is we've configured an alert that will trigger if any blobs are deleted from our blob storage account over the last 5 minutes. That 5-minute window is configured down at the bottom of this panel. Anyway, let's click Done. Good. So now we have a condition. So what would this alert do if that condition was met? Well, for that, you need to configure an action. So let's scroll down to the Actions section. And now let's click on the Add Actions Groups link. Good. Now it's worth noting that when alerts are triggered, the actions that they take are against action groups. The reason for that is because the actions might be shared across many alerts. So rather than defining the actions over and over and over again, you can define an action group, configure what the actions are, and then associate that action group to your alert simply by clicking on some checkboxes. Now, actions can be things like sending out emails, making entries in application insights, and so on. Now, I won't bother creating an action group or even configuring an action in this case, so let's just close this panel and move on. All right, so now we have an alert and we're happy with it. So let's go ahead and name it. Let's scroll down to the bottom of the alert configuration page. Now let's give our alert a name. I'm going to call mine SBDemo17 Metric Alert. Good. Now let's change the severity. Let's pretend that I think blob deletions are bad. Not horrible, but I need to know when these things are happening quickly. So let's change the severity to warning. Good. Now our alert is finally ready to go. So let's click on the Create Alert Rule button at the bottom of the screen. All right, so now we have an alert configured, but nothing's happening here though. So let's make something happen. In the left-hand menu, let's scroll up to the Storage Explorer and then navigate to our blob container. Good. Now let's upload something. I'm going to upload a simple picture. And now let's close this upload panel. Okay, now let's select the item that we just uploaded and delete it by clicking the Delete option from the More toolbar button and confirming the delete. Perfect. We've deleted something. So if our alert works, it should now be active. So let's head back to the Alerts page. Huzzah! We have an active alert in the warning severity. So let's click on Warning. There's our alert. It's shown as being in a new state. So let's click on it. Nice. Now we're seeing a bunch of information. We can see the reason it fired, when it fired, and its current state. So now let's say we've seen this and we're going to take whatever corrective action is needed, and we want to signal to others that we've got this. In that case, we want to change the state of the alert. So let's click on the Change Alert State button. Good. Now in the pull-down menu, let's change the state to Acknowledged. Good. Now let's click Save. All right, the state updated to Acknowledged. So let's close this panel. And now let's go back to the main Alerts panel by clicking on the breadcrumb at the top of the page. Perfect! The alert is now being shown as acknowledged. Fantastic! So there you have it. We've gone into one of our resources, in this case the Blob storage account, and we've configured an alert to fire based on custom conditions against metrics that we've collected about our storage account. We were able to see the alert trigger, and we were able to manipulate the status of the alert in the UI. Fantastic job. Most Azure services, including your own most likely, generate telemetry. Telemetry is more commonly referred to as logs or metrics. For the most part, Azure monitoring tools pick that telemetry up automatically. But what about systems that aren't specifically Azure resources? For example, what about systems like virtual machines? Well, that's where Azure Log Analytics Agent comes in. With the Log Analytics Agent, you can collect that telemetry. Specifically, Azure Log Analytics Agent can be used to collect telemetry generated from Windows and Linux VMs. They don't even have to be on the cloud. The Log Analytics Agent collects these logs and then transmits that data to an Azure Log Analytics workspace, like Azure Monitor. The agent collects the telemetry, and then the workspace serves it. What that means is that the Log Analytics agent can collect telemetry from these virtual systems and transmit them to a central log manager so that you can gain critical insights on your data and offer much needed support services. But it's not just Azure Monitor that the Log Analytics agent transmits its data to. In fact, there are all kinds of Azure services that the agent can connect to. For example, you can use the agent to transmit virtual system information to Azure VM Insights, and that makes sense since it's geared towards VMs. The Azure Security Center is another useful tool to use because it can help you track and resolve security issues in your system overall, including your VMs. Sending information to the Azure Automation Service can help you iron out your ability to deliver solutions across hybrid solutions that are in the cloud and on-prem. Azure Sentinel is similar to Azure Security Center, so it can make use of the telemetry data from that agent too. And of course, the change tracking tool can use the telemetry too, so it can track changes made to your systems. Now, each of your virtual systems also need to perform periodic updates, so it also makes sense to transmit telemetry information to the Azure Update Management Service so it can manage those updates appropriately. And then there's the hybrid runbook worker, which is similar to Azure Automation for managing hybrid systems. So you can see that this telemetry that the agent collects is potentially highly valuable to all kinds of systems. Okay, so the agent is valuable and it can collect telemetry data, but what does that mean exactly? What kind of data does it actually collect? Well, first, let's just be clear right off the bat that the Log Analytics agent can and will collect whatever custom logs you generate. So let's say you have your own applications and services running on a virtual machine. Well, you can use the agent to collect those logs. The only requirement is that there's a predictable format to those logs so you can know how to parse them. Now, beyond that, though, the Log Analytics agent can collect all kinds of standard logs and automatically know how to parse them. So, a common example of that would be your web logs from IIS. Now, it's not very often that you'll use a virtual machine to host something like IIS anymore, but it certainly isn't uncommon. So, it's nice to know that you can still collect those logs and analyze them. And performance logs is another thing the agent can collect. And when it comes to monitoring VMs, that's very nice indeed. So this can include standard things like CPU, memory, disk utilization, but it can also collect specific custom performance metrics generated by custom applications. And if your system produces a syslog like Linux, then the agent can collect that too. And if it's Windows that you're using, then even the event logs can be captured by the agent and transmitted to your workspace. Now, I mentioned that the Log Analytics agent collects telemetry information and transmits it for consumption. So let's quickly talk about the logistics of where the agent sends its data. First and foremost, the Log Analytics agent transmits its data to a Log Analytics workspace in Azure Monitor. Data can be consumed from there by a variety of services. Now, when a Log Analytics agent is installed on a Windows system, it can actually be configured to transmit its collected telemetry to multiple workspaces. And that can be valuable if there are multiple Azure systems in the mix. So imagine a system that's been deployed on-prem and is used as part of a joint venture, or maybe there's just a customer and a vendor. In those cases, it's useful to have the telemetry transmitted to multiple locations so that it can be consumed appropriately by engineers from the different teams. Now, unfortunately, the log analytics agent for Linux can only send its collected telemetry to one single destination. So if that telemetry is needed in multiple systems, you'll need to transmit the collected information from the log analytics workbook instead. And finally, let's just touch on those limitations a bit. The log analytics agent isn't all sunshine and rainbows, there are limitations. Now, as I said, the Linux agent only supports connecting to a single workspace, so that can be a problem for some businesses. And while the Windows agent supports connecting to multiple workspaces, it too is limited. With the Windows agent, you can only connect to 4 workspaces. Generally, that should be enough, but if you do need more than 4, then you'd be out of luck. And lastly, while both the Windows and the Linux agents support the FIPS 140 standard, other types of hardening like SIPs and Selinux may not be supported. In this demo, we're going to create an alert based on activities that are performed against our Azure resource. To do that, we're going to piggyback off of one of our Azure resources to show where we can find and create alerts of this type. Then we'll create an alert and watch as the system updates. Alright, so as before, the first thing we need to do is head over to the Azure portal in our browser. Perfect. Now, in the various demos that we've done in this course, we went over how to monitor various types of metrics in our Azure resources. In this demo, we're going to go over how to monitor and alert on various types of activities performed against our Azure resources. We'll generate an alert and then view the output of that alert. So let's get started. Let's head over to our Azure Blob storage account one more time. Now I'm going to search for mine in the top search bar and then click on it to navigate to it. Mine was called SBDemo17 Blob. Perfect. So here's our Blob storage account. It's doing its thing, and thanks to our monitoring and our alerting, we know it's working great. But what we don't know is if anyone has physically done anything with our Blob storage account. And how can we know that? Well, one way to do that is to view the activity log. In fact, let's do that. Let's click on the activity log item in the left-hand menu. Perfect. Now what we're seeing in here is the various activities that have been performed against this storage account over the last 6 hours. Now we can certainly sit here in front of this screen and just watch this list to make sure no one does anything we don't like, but I think we'd probably go mad if we did. Instead, we want Azure to tell us if something's wrong. So let's set that up. Let's scroll down to the monitoring section and click on alerts. Good. Now, just like we saw in our last demo about alerts, this screen shows us how many alerts that we've had in the time range that we've selected, in our case, the last 24 hours. We're also seeing the alerts by severity and whether people have acknowledged or closed the alerts. But what we really want to do in this demo is create an alert about activity people have performed and that we find interesting. So let's do it. Let's create an alert. In the toolbar, let's click on the New Alert Rule button. Alright, now this screen allows us to build an alert for our storage account. In the Scope section at the top, our storage account has already been selected for us. And once again, it is worth noting that you can build and view alerts globally through the Azure Monitoring app. But doing it through this view will make things a bit easier for us to see. Anyway, now we know which resource we're monitoring. But what are we monitoring it for? Well, for that, we need to create a condition. So in the Condition section, let's click on the Add Condition link. Perfect. So here we get to see all the different metrics and activities that we can monitor for our storage account. In our earlier demo, we created an alert about a metric. This demo, we'll create an alert about an activity. So let's invent something here that we can test easily. Let's create an alert that will tell us if our storage account keys have been regenerated. Now keep in mind that if keys change, anyone connecting to our storage account is gonna have problems. So this might actually be a pretty useful alert. So let's select the Regenerate Storage Account Keys signal from the list. Good. Now we're seeing all the times that these keys have been regenerated over the last 6 hours, which is none. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Now, we don't really have to configure anything special when we attach to this signal, so let's go ahead and click on the Done button at the bottom of the panel. Good. So now we have a condition. So what will this alert do if a condition is met? Well, for that, you need to configure an action. Now remember from our previous demo that action groups are something that you can configure so that they can be shared across multiple alerts. Now, we're not going to bother creating an action group, so we're going to just skip past this section. But suffice it to say that you can use action groups to email people, log special messages to application insights, and so on. And you can share these action groups across many, many, many alerts. Now, in the case of regenerating keys, it makes a lot of sense to email your site reliability engineers, or SREs, so that they can take action if that was somehow unexpected. Anyway, at this point, we have an alert configured and we are happy with it. So let's go ahead and name it. So let's scroll down to the bottom of the alert configuration page. Now, let's give our alert a name, and I'm going to call mine SBDemo17 Activity Alert. Good. Now notice that we never set a severity, and we'll touch on that in a bit. Regardless, for now, our alert is ready to go. So let's finally click on the Create Alert Rule button at the bottom of the screen. Good. So now we have an alert configured, and nothing's happened yet, but let's make something happen. In the left-hand menu, let's scroll up to the Access Keys option and click on it. Good. Now let's regenerate a key. To do that, click on the little refresh icon to the right of either of the key names. I'm going to click on Key 1. Now remember that changing a key can affect connections, so notice that Azure is warning us right away. Well, we're pretty certain about what we want to do here, so let's go ahead and click Yes to confirm that we really want to regenerate this key. Good. Our key has been updated, so if our alert works, it should now be active. So let's head back to the Alerts page. Huzzah! We have new content in the verbose section. So now remember earlier when I said that we couldn't set the severity? Well, that's because the alerts that are generated are based on the same severity as the activity we're monitoring. Changing the keys is important to me, and I might really want to email myself about it, but from a usability of Azure perspective, it's pretty mundane. Anyway, let's click on the verbose label. There's our alert. Actually, notice that it's shown twice, and ultimately that's an Azure issue, not anything that we did. But notice how they're shown as being in a new state. So let's click on one of them. Nice. Now we're seeing a bunch of information, and we see the reason it fired, when it fired, who did it, and a bunch more information about the resource itself, as well as the alert's current state. So now let's say we've seen this and we've taken whatever correction action was needed, and we want to close the alert. In that case, we want to change the state of the alert. So let's click on the Change Alert State button. Good. Now in the pull-down menu, let's change the state to Closed. And then we'll give some kind of a comment. And then we click Save. Good. The state updated to Closed. So let's close this panel. And now let's go back to the main Alerts panel by clicking on the breadcrumb at the top of the page. And now let's hit the Refresh Toolbar button. Perfect. The alert is now shown as being in a closed state. Fantastic. And there you have it. We've gone into one of our resources, in this case the Blob storage account, and we've configured an alert to fire based on custom conditions against activities we're interested in. We were able to see that alert trigger, and we were able to manipulate the status of the alert. Fantastic job. So in this course, we've examined the Azure Monitor service, and we did this by exploring features of the Azure Monitor service, monitoring Azure Blob Storage and Data Lake Storage Gen 2, monitoring Azure Synapse Analytics jobs in Azure Cosmos DB using the portal, configuring the Azure Monitor, and configuring Azure Log Analytics alerts. In our next course, we'll move on to examine Azure Data Process Optimization.